Today's date is November 5th, 2025. This is Luciana Spracher representing the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives. I am interviewing Tom Kohler for the Savannah Community Memory Project. We are conducting this interview at Savannah City Hall. Thank you for joining us today. Let's start by having you tell us your full name and spell it.
My full name is Thomas Wood Kohler, and that would be Thomas space WOOD space KOHLER.
Okay. And when and where were you born?
I was born at the Telfair Hospital on Park Avenue, and I was born there on January the 15th, 1952.
Okay. Tell me about your father, his name, where he was from, what he did for a living.
My father was Michael Ehrlich Kohler. He was from Savannah. He grew up on the corner of 45th and Abercorn until the stock market crash, and his family lost pretty much everything. He was in sales after that, lived with his Aunt Lucy, and then volunteered to go into World War II and returned. And he and a man named Samuel Herman opened a business called Hendrick's Mattress Company, which is on 40th between Abercorn and Habersham. And they made mattresses, had about 20 people working for them. And Mr. Herman kind of ran the inside of the operation. And my father was the sales guy, and so he would usually leave Monday mornings, be gone Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe come back Thursday, or be gone Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and come back midday Friday.
So you mentioned he served in World War II. Do you know where he served or what branch?
He was in the United States Army, and he was a sergeant. He was a radio man, and he basically walked across Europe. And I have kept his army boots that he wore, and they fit me. I've kept his sergeant's jacket, which does not fit me. It's not too big. It's too small. And I have kept the Bible that he was issued by the Army that he walked through Europe with. And I've kept that on my desk ever since I've had a desk.
And as a salesman for the mattress company, he went out on the road and had like a region that he covered?
Right. I mean, pretty much, coastal Georgia, up and down the coast, Charleston, maybe as far as Columbia, South Carolina sometimes, down to Brunswick, Jacksonville. That was kind of the region. Many of the people that he would call on were, they were mostly furniture stores, and many of those were owned by Jewish people. And in a funny sort of way, I learned much later in my life that he and other Jewish traveling salesmen were also kind of like the internet, is they heard what was going on in each little town, particularly with regard to the Jewish community, and then they would be the person that would talk about it in the next town, in the next week, and that kind of thing. Arnold Young, who you may have known, who was attorney with Hunter McLean for, 50 years or whatever. Arnold's father owned a furniture store, I believe, either Bluffton or Beaufort, and Arnold has talked to me about that was kind of the way that worked. And then occasionally in the summertime, I would go on the road with my father, and we would visit these furniture stores, including Mr. Joseph Evans' furniture store in Collins, Georgia. And Mr. Evans, a Jewish man, changed his name. And then I would later, 25 years later, meet Mr. Evans, because he was the chairman of the Association for, quote, Retarded Citizens, to use the language of the day. He was the chairman of that county's Association for Retarded Citizens because he had a son. And so I had known him from when I was 8 years old, traveling with my dad. I will tell one quick story. We went to see Mr. Evans. He had a big furniture store. Downtown, there's not much going on in that downtown at all. It's mostly empty buildings. One big store, furniture store, this big old kind of rundown building. And we go in and we sit down, and Mr. Evans sees this person, sees that person, talks to this person. We're not getting any love. And I said, well, what's going on? And my father said, well, you see those people, those are what we call customers. And they'll be giving him money. We're what we call salespeople. We'll be asking him to give us money. So we'll be here until all those people leave. So that was like a big, insight about how the world worked. Many of the folks that had stores up in these smaller towns had been grub-staked by the Jewish community. And that would be the way they would help people get their start. And also probably decrease the amount of competition, quite frankly, in Savannah or in the larger cities.
So, so the Kohler family, had they been in Savannah for many generations?
I think my father's father immigrated, but I don't know very much about him at all. My understanding is that when that they lived again on 45th and Abercorn, and had a pair of matched Packards, had a touring car and a convertible, and obviously were doing quite well. And then they weren't. And my understanding is that my father's father, who I never met, cracked, if you will, and wound up dying. I think at Central State School and Hospital at Milledgeville. He was institutionalized after he had this nervous breakdown after that. But and then my father had one sister who moved to New York immediately, and I probably in my lifetime didn't spend but 20 hours with her, maybe. So it kind of was what it was.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So tell me about your mother. Tell me her name, where she was from, what she did for a living.
Yeah. Her name was Margaret Wood before she married, and she was Methodist. And so it was it was a mixed marriage back in that day. My father being Jewish and being part of the Mikveh Israel congregation. My mom had been born, I believe, in Barnesville. She was adopted by her parents as their only child, and late in life and late in their lives. My understanding is she went to Juilliard and briefly, but then her mother, and then she wound up in Rome, Georgia as a businesswoman, and then her mother contracted cancer, and she came back to Savannah to take care of her mother. Again, she's the only child of an older parent, and she and my father obviously met each other and created me, and then later created my brother. And she did not work outside the home. Active, she was a PTA president for 2 years at her school, and then did the things, carpool, road carpool, her school PTA, bridge. Took care of my brother and I, which was no small task, because I look back, we could have been better.
You said Hurd or Hurdy?
Hurd.
Hurd.
Virginia Hurd, Lloyd Hurd School.
Okay.
Yeah. And just to say, I walked to school, Alderman Elementary School, walked to school with the same bunch of people, and some of those people I still know today. So that was kind of a nice touch.
So I'll get back to that.
Sure.
What's your brother's name?
My brother's name is David Ehrlich Kohler, and David lives now in Alaska. He, like me, is a public school kid out of Savannah, Georgia, and he did everything except his dissertation toward a PhD in psychology, and worked in public school systems in Rome, Georgia, and then here, and then met his now wife there, and they moved to Atlanta. And then one day I got a phone call. He said, "We're moving to Alaska." And I said, "Well, what's that about?" And he said, they were living in Gwinnett County at the time. He said, "We want to live somewhere where nature's still winning," because they had watched Gwinnett County just be, clear cut and turned into a parking lot, basically. And so they moved up there 35 years ago, and from what I can tell, they've just had a great life. They've had 2 more children, and they've got grandchildren, and they go out and catch fish and feed, like hundreds, like feed their, the freezer's all full and, all that. So, and then he's kept himself in really nice physical condition, which is nice. So he's able to continue to, be outside and do all the things that Alaska seems to expect you to do. Yeah.
So you mentioned walking to Hurd Elementary. So tell me about where you were living or lived when you were growing up.
Sure. When I was first born, we lived on Siler Avenue, a couple of blocks to the west of Waters Avenue. And I would be taken in my stroller down Waters Avenue toward Victory Drive to the little commercial strip there that's still there. And Tibble's Bakery was the destination. And so I'm notorious in my family for being able to look up from the stroller and saying 2 words. That was Cookie Tibble. And so Cookie Tibble, and I get a cookie. That's really almost all I remember from that neighborhood. I was small. Mr. Hoinstein lived in that neighborhood, and Rosalind, I think was his wife's name, and she was the principal at McVisral Temple at the Sunday school, and he was known as the Tomato Man. And so one of my earliest, again, visual memories, at least I think it's a memory, is him putting tomatoes down on the tray of my stroller, and then we would stroll back home. So that's probably was 4 or 5 when we moved to Varn Drive. And Varn Drive would be the first street south of Durin on Haversham. And it's just a little cul-de-sac, so you get to see it twice right before you get to Haversham Woods. And we moved there, and I think in 56 or 7. And we were one of the first houses out there. This is pre-Haversham Woods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a great place to grow up because it was a post-World War II neighborhood. Tons of kids. You could get 2 sides of a baseball game together just pretty easily. It's 18 kids, so lots of kids. That was great. And if you went north, let's say on Haversham, you would get to the Haversham Shopping Center, which is still there, and it was a Woolworths. And so then if you went south on Haversham, you were in the woods. And so if you're a kid, there's nothing better than that, right? You can get on your bike and get to Woolworths, you can get on your bike and get into the woods. So it was a great neighborhood to grow up in. Hurd School was within walking distance over on Lee Boulevard. And then I did Hurd, and then Wilder, which used to be right behind Memorial Hospital. Memorial got torn down, and Memorial kind of took the land. And then Jenkins High School is where I finished up in 1970. All 3 of those schools were post-World War II baby boom schools. They couldn't build them fast enough. And I'm also the last class, I believe, pre-busing in the high school. My brother, for example, so I went to school for 12 years, basically with the same kids, basically. My brother, when he was 2 years younger, my brother, when he graduated from Beach rather than Jenkins. And when he was a sophomore, he was bused to Beach, transferred to Beach. And so that's when a lot of things in Savannah got complicated. And, I've got friends that still kind of can't get over it, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. How did your brother feel about that?
We were, well, 2 things. One, it's not like he was the only person, it was a group. So there was that. I think that's a great question. My family, in the scheme of things, I think you would describe my family as sort of racially liberal people. And I don't remember it being a big, big deal, quite frankly. But the other side of it is, I'm like, I'm not paying that much attention to what my brother thinks. He's just my little pesky brother, just to get real with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
What's the age difference?
2 years. Yeah. You know, Scott Center has a very interesting story about being at Beach and about former Mayor Jackson coming there as like a mentor almost from Savannah State. And that's how they met when Beach was integrated. And they had Savannah State students come and kind of help people think about things or whatever, et cetera. So, but he's got a very interesting, long, deep storyline with he and Representative Jackson with Edna.
So before we move on from the schools you went to, let's talk a little bit about going to those schools. Were there any like teachers or leaders at that school that maybe we should mention?
Mary Dunn was the principal at Hurd, and I think by any standard she was considered to be a top-notch educator. She came out of the same family as Mitchell Dunn, who was Hunter McLean actually in Dunn. And I guess in some ways this is back in a time where there weren't that many career opportunities for women, and so you either taught or you were a nurse. But so she was, I think, the exception by any standards. It was a pretty solid group of teachers up and down the line there, really. Othla Woodcock in 6th grade was a great teacher, and then the first young teacher that we had was Miss Bowen. Up until then, the teachers were old. That would, of course, mean over 35 or 40 when you're 11. But Miss Bowen was like 22, just right out of college, and we were in the 6th grade. That was a different experience for 12-year-old boys. And she was also a USO, just to use the language of the day, she was a USO girl. So she would, some Friday night, she would go down to the USO, which is now, I think, Better Hall, the armory that SCAD, I think the first building SCAD bought. And so upstairs, there would be the USO, and there'd be music and dancing, and USO girls to dance with soldiers. And the Beatles hit when I was in the 6th grade. And one of our class projects was to form a little group of people and put on a skit. Okay. Well, once the Beatles hit, every single skit was the same thing. It was the Beatles, just one Beatles act after the next, basically. But somehow our Beatles act was deemed good enough that we should be invited to go to the USO and entertain the troops, which we did. And so it was 3 boys playing Spanish folk guitars and me with a snare drum, lip syncing I Want to Hold Your Hand. And Miss Bowen, of course, being a USO girl, she was the person that arranged all that. So that was a highlight of the 6th grade. Interestingly, at least to me, within the past year, I got a phone call from one of her children, and they were collecting stories about her life for her. Let's see, she would have been 10 years, let's say she was 10 to 15 years older, so she'd still be under 90. And so they were collecting stories about her life, and I guess through the power of the internet, they figured out who some of the kids were from the 6th grade. And so I was able to tell them that story. And one other story I can't repeat here. And I said, you get to pick decide which one you want to use. And he said, USO, trust me. So yeah. In junior high school, Mr. Ball, a very, cantankerous, kind of wonderful guy. And then that's kind of when I first met the first young, hip male teacher, Mr. Cargill, and he lasted about 2 years, and he was out. But I mean, that was my first sense of that. Okay, you could be under 40 and be a guy and actually teach. And he would stop doing that, and then he was part of the Cargill's family that had an office supply spot on State Street for many years. Junior high basically was just a time of terror. Terror because, none of us knew what to do about girls. we were horrible. We were petrified by girls in general, and then the upperclassmen just were horrible to us and beat us up a lot. So.
Was Wilder, what grades did Wilder cover?
7, 8, 9. Yeah. I was in the band. I started playing trumpet, but then I was switched to tuba.
You didn't have a choice?
Didn't seem like it. So I wound up playing the tuba, which, was what it was. My mother would have to come pick it up in the 62 Chevy station wagon. And it'd get put in the back of the station wagon so I could practice on the weekends. And then I would practice in my room, but it would make the windows shake like this, and the little younger children in the neighborhood would come and sit outside the windows and listen to, anyway. So that wasn't a highlight, And then Jenkins, again, I had this little group of friends. We were real tight. None of us were really super active in school. I mean, when you look at the yearbook, the stuff people did, none of us were doing much. What we were doing was just hanging out with each other, And again, I mean, the Beatles hit when I was in 6th grade, and that really, that was music, it was politics, it was culture, it was a break from the past. And if you're 12 years old and you get to jump on that train at that age, like, here's the future. I mean, it's pretty intoxicating. So I'd say that was really a big part of for me, that's kind of how things just emerged in that way.
You are a follower of music, aren't you? I feel like.
Yeah, I pay attention. Not like I used to. I mean, it's impossible.
Is that where it started, though? Do you think?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. I mean, yeah, and I mean, there used to be like Billy Joe Royal was from Savannah, and so there was like local TV, WTOC would have live local programming, and Buddy Livingston and the Versatones were part of that, and so I can remember seeing that and realize that was like here in Savannah, local, if you will. But I think for people in my generation, maybe the Beatles, but also, I mean, soul music. I mean, I was a big James Brown fan really early on, and went to see James Brown at the National Guard Armory before I could drive, and there was not very, it was probably 99% African American audience and a few young guys. Oddly enough, Jack Lee, the famous photographer, we realized much later in our lives that we'd both been in the same room that night, as an example. And
so I wasn't planning on asking you this question, but since you kind of brought this up, did you go to the arena that had been off Gwinnett Street in East Savannah for any sporting events or musical?
Yeah, that was Webster's, and the Battle of the Bands would take place there. And the Battle of the Bands was actually, as I understand it, the Battle of the Bands was an idea that was thunk up in New England by a JC organization. And again, this was part of this notion of once the Beatles hit, I mean, the number of little bands that started in Savannah, and well, all over the country, was just extraordinary. And there's a statistic about guitar sales, like the number of guitars that were sold the month, the quarter before the Beatles hit, I'll make up a number, was 10,000. The quarter after the Beatles hit, the number of guitars were sold in the United States was more like, I'll make up a number, 150,000, just exponential. And so, not to belabor this, but I am, not to belabor this, but when the Beatles played the Ed Sullivan Show, we all, that Friday, we wore our hair like this, right? And then you came to school on Monday, and all the boys had done their flat tops and their crew cuts like this. I mean, it was like that, just instant. If you had an older brother, and I think you can still feel this today. Like, I've got a friend whose brother is 5 years older, okay? And he's a Kingston Trio. He grew up kind of with Kingston Trio and kind of the old rock and roll, Elvis, etc. his politics, in my opinion, his cultural worldview have maintained, are still tied to that. My friend, 5 years younger, Beatles, and his politics and cultural framework is based on that. So, I mean, it was a big deal. What else about that era? So yeah, Webster's the Battle of the Bands, and the idea was this was a place for all these bands to kind of compete to win the Battle of the Bands. And so the Battle of the Bands, in a lot of ways, was one of the cauldrons, this, in my opinion, was one of the cauldrons that kind of created and nurtured the counterculture here in Savannah, and I'm sure in other places. And I'm not so sure that's what JC's had in mind. That this would be the, this would be the dope smoking, hippie loving crowd is they were going to actually kind of support, create. So yeah, I do remember that. They had live wrestling there, and I think my father took us to that once to see Sputnik Monroe, who was a famous wrestler. My brother and I loved wrestling on Saturdays. That was a big deal. TV. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you are still pretty tight with some of the same people you used to walk to elementary school with. Who are some of those friends that you have basically grown up your whole life with?
Yeah. Well, Rick Gannan would be one. Rick came to Jenkins in the 6th grade. He transferred in, and he's a very well-respected attorney locally, and is a judge out in Pooler, and just been civically active his whole life. When Ricky came he came mid-year to Ms. Woodcock's class, sat next to me, and we were doing diagramming, which he had not done in his previous school. He looked over my paper and said, "Well, how do you do this?" And I looked back and said, "Beats me." And then about really 2 weeks later, I was looking at his paper and saying, "How do you do this?" And he would say, "Let me show you." And that's really been our relationship ever since. I mean, Ricky has been so kind to me about just let me show you, So we've maintained a great relationship. And then my friend Donnie Cogdell, Donnie and I met each other in the 2nd grade, and we carpooled. And I do think that there's something about the people you carpool with that creates a bond like no other bond, because it's 7 o'clock in the morning. None of you want to be there. You're all stuffed into this car with somebody else's mother, or even worse, your own mother, right? And you're going to school, which you don't want to do, right? Okay. And then on the way home, it's usually a little bit better because it's not 7 in the morning. But Donnie was, his mom was a carpool mom, and my mom was a carpool mom, and his mother was quite colorful and entertaining, but she also had premonitions. And she would have this premonition, somebody pass away, and then like a week later, they'd be dead. And so the joke in the car was, Miss Cogdell, if you dream about me, don't tell me, right? Yeah. Mr. Cogdell also was the person that came to pick Donnie and I up from the James Brown concert when we were, 13, 14, I don't know. Anyway, and it was the National Guard Armory on Eisenhower Drive, unair conditioned, summertime. And Mr. Cogdell was from Alabama and ran the railroad here. A wonderful man. Just a wise, decent, kind man, but from Alabama. And so he sees just hundreds and hundreds of African American people streaming out of National Guard Armory. Pretty excited because we just had quite a moment there when Donnie and I were some of the last to leave, because we were lingering, because it's like wow. And we see Mr. Cogdell, and we can tell. We walk over. He's not very happy, and so he says, "In the car, boys." That's all he says. And we get in the car. Not a word. We get to my house, and he says, "Good night, Tom." That was it. It's not what, I don't think my mother knew where we were going, or if she did, she didn't know the implication. It's hard to say, but anyway.
Did you go to the James Brown concert in Forsyth Park when SCAD had it.
Yeah, I did. I've seen James Brown several times, and I've had an odd James Brown experience at South Carolina State University. A friend of mine called me one day and said there was an exhibit up there called Holocaust in the American South that she thought I'd be interested in, and I was, so we drove up together. And she knew the assistant curator, and so while we were there, I saw that there was a program from when James Brown was on campus for sale for $10. And I said, like in a gift shop kind of thing. And I said, I'd be happy to buy that because I'm a big fan. And he said, oh, he says, we have, when James Brown died, they cleaned out his house. We have his memorabilia. I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, I'd love to see it. He said, no, it's in storage. I mean, you know more. It's in the archive. We can't do this. I said, okay. So we walk out to the car to leave, and this gentleman, he kind of follows us out and runs to the car and says, oh, go ahead, oh, what the heck, come on back in. So we go back in, which is just like a James Brown stage show, because the cape, it was just like that, So we go back in, we open the vault, which is great, get in there. And it's like James Brown's suits and everything, it's like his clothes and everything. And all of a sudden I see this pair of purple suede boots that come up, ankle-high boots. And I think, that's pretty much the boots. I mean, that's the kind of boots he was wearing when he was in Savannah. So in my mind, I think those are the boots that I saw him in, okay? So I make some comment about the boots, and I said, I'd really like to. He said, no, you can't touch anything. Okay, so thank you so much. We walk all the way back to the car. He comes out of the thing and says, said, come on back. So we go back in, we open the thing again, and he lets me touch things. So I've got a picture somewhere of me holding the James Brown shoes up like this, In my imagination, again, they were the shoes he wore when I saw him in Savannah.
The first time?
The first time, yeah. Also went to his funeral. And that was when I bartended at Jim Collins' bar. We used to have a bar joke. And if we liked somebody, if we liked a new customer, we would say, hey, listen, when James Brown passes away, we're going to go to the funeral. And we had a little clipboard. We said, you want to get on the list? He'd say, sure. Okay, well, then James Brown died. And I started getting phone calls about going to the funeral. I was like, okay. So I called Roxana Lester, who was the editor of the paper. I knew, and I said, hey, Roxana, if I do this, can you put it in the paper? She said, oh, sure. So I called her, rented a Greyhound bus, and she put in the paper that, if you wanted to go see the James Brown funeral in Augusta, call this number and get on the bus. And so we had all these people show up at the house that morning, at 6, and we charged, I think, $30. We'd made sandwiches the night before, and we rode up. I think the youngest person on the bus was 6. The oldest person, I think, was 86 or something. We rode up singing and got to the arena and got to the funeral. It seemed to me that kind of like the last seats. It was just packed. We all got in there, and it was extraordinary. You had James Brown. He was dead. You had James Brown. You had Michael Jackson. You had Al Sharpton. You had 2 other prominent African-American entertainer politicians. I mean, really 5 of the most dominant African-American citizens in the country there. And I'll never forget Roxana. The funeral is just unbelievable, of course. And as soon as the funeral's over, Roxana says, let the feuding begin. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, there was all that confusion about who got what, and his legacy, and also all that. But anyway, so yeah, so James Brown and I have got a lot through the years going back and forth. Yeah.
This is going to get me off of my question list, but you brought it up, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you about it now while it's on my mind, and it's about Jim Collins and your relationship with that bar and what just happened recently to celebrate it.
Right.
So without asking you a specific question, why don't you just tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, when I went to Armstrong, I first week at Armstrong, I was in an honors comp English class, and a gentleman sitting across next to me was a man named Jay Marino, and he had actually already was back from Vietnam. He'd been a Navy medic, and we just leaned over one time and said, "You want to go get a beer tonight?" And I said, "I'm not old enough." And he said, "I know a place where you'll be old enough." And so I was living at my mother's house. He came and picked me up, and he drove a 142 Volvo 5-speed, I remember right, because he had some money because he'd been in the military and, you know, he'd saved some money. So he had this great brand new Volvo. We came down Drayton Street, I'll bet it's 70 miles an hour, and probably at 9 o'clock at night, or probably 9 o'clock at night. And this is back, Savannah's pretty much empty at night.
So what year?
1970, 1971. 1970, yeah, fall of 1971. So downtown Savannah was pretty empty at night then. So, I mean, we come flying down Drayton Street, and I mean, it's almost like we leave the ground as we go over like Jones Street and some of those, you know, boom, 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 get the gems, corner of Lincoln and Bryan. And there's really just no sign. There's like a door. You open the door, and a cowbell rings, ka-cling, and you're in. And it's really small, and the ceiling is really low, like reach up and touch it low. And there's literally nobody there, no bartender. And so we go sit at the bar, 12, 15 stools, and there are 3 tables. And Jim comes out from the back, and Jay says, Jim, this is Tom, this is Jim. And Jim says, well, any friend of Jay was a friend of mine, shook his hand. So 2 draft beers and 2 cheeseburgers. The beers were 50 cents, and I think the cheeseburgers might have been $1. And Jay paid for the first one, and I went there like 4 to 6 nights a week for you know, all through my college days here. And then when Jim had to close that bar and look for another place, it took about a year. He found a place over on Whitaker Street, and so I got involved in that, you know, like Jim's and all that, like Jim. I mean, the other thing, just to say, Jim Collins worked 6 nights a week, 52 weeks a year, year after year. There was no other bartender. So when you went to Jim's, it was Jim's. And sometimes you go to Jim's and there'd be nobody else there, and then it would be you and Jim. And some of those conversations would be different. Jim, for example, believed that during the oil embargo and the gas crisis during Carter administration, he had believed that we used up all the dinosaur oil, and that the solution to this problem would be if we would stop burying people in caskets and just bury people straight in the ground, that we would dissolve quicker and make oil quicker, and that would be, well, I mean, this is your bartender. What you gonna do? You gonna nod your head and say, mm-hmm, and you're not gonna argue with him. So, like that. He also had the best jukebox in Savannah by anybody's, I think, by anybody's measure. And so he was a great music fan, played. He'd been a photographer in part of his life, and he had taken pictures of some of the country acts out of the Bamboo Ranch out on Highway 17 right after World War II. So he had these pictures of a lot of the country acts that had, when they played the Bamboo Ranch, they maybe just started to kind of come up into the national limelight. But as time went by, they'd come up in the national limelight. So he had you know, he had a lot of that kind of interesting stuff. He lived upstairs, and his wife Lola, you know, got to know her over time, and then Kathleen, his daughter, and who I still know really well. And Kathleen told us that they used to sometimes take a champagne glass and turn it, and then put their ear in like a stethoscope. So they would listen to us, and she once said, you know, we knew a lot more about you than you think we knew. And so it just had its own little, it was a mixture of college students from Armstrong, professors, which was kind of a nice touch, and a lot of professors lived downtown in the 70s because it was cheap. So you could buy something or rent something super cheap downtown, teach at Armstrong.
And this is when Armstrong was Still downtown or had moved out?
I had moved out. Yeah, I never went to the downtown campus, but had moved out. But so you'd see professors, some lawyers, and then kind of a mishmash of anybody else. It was really quite a small melting pot. If the right people were in the place when it was closing time, Jim would call last call, and you'd get a couple beers, and then he'd bring out guitars, and people would play and sing until dawn sometimes, and then the door was open. So I mean, there was some magic moments like that. Some of the talent that would later be on River Street, not in the 70s, but some of the talent that would be on River Street would come to Jim's after they'd finished up, and REM came to Jim's. Leon Redbone repetitively came to Jim's. So it just was what it was in a very particular way. He cooked for a while, hamburgers, French fries, a couple of things, soup. And if you ordered French fries, I think what he did is just cut a whole bag of all-rounder potatoes. He just cut the frozen and just cooked all those frozen potatoes, and that was one order. So it was huge. But there was no ketchup. And you'd say, well, it's too expensive. But all the regulars had ketchup in our cars. And so we were prepared. And if a newcomer came and ordered French fries and you could hear that happening, you'd see somebody just get up, go to their car, open the glove compartment, and bring the ketchup in. So it was unique. When he moved over to Whitaker Street, he closed because they wanted to raise the rent from $100 to $200. And he wouldn't do it. Just out of principle, he wouldn't do it. They were going to close the bar, and it was set to be closed, and it was closing night, and whoever had bought the building came down and saw who it turned out and what it meant, and so gave him a year reprieve, and so that was nice. But then the bar did close, and then he wound up over on Whitaker Street, kind of where El Rocco is now, and the Malava family owned that, and that worked out fine until they decided they wanted to redo the building, and they would have let us stay and put us back in, but they would have had to raise the rent to a point that, given the way Jim thought about his bar, he couldn't have paid the rent. And so the bar finally, and then he passed away, and we kept the bar open for several years with volunteer bartenders and friends and all that. And the Jim Collins Bar Alumni Association was formed, and we would have a potluck dinner once a month there and auction off stuff from people's houses. We could raise a few $100s pretty easily, and that would money, if the bar didn't break even, I mean, Ms. Collins, we'd make sure that she got that money, that kind of thing. So, and then it was kind of a public living room, I think would be a way to think about it. You kind of had to know to go, and there was a little honor if you'd been thrown out of gyms. That was kind of a red badge of courage. There was no dancing, kissing, or pennies at gyms. No cussing, except you could cuss 6 nights a week, but the 7th night you couldn't cuss. I mean, it was, the rules were enforced in not necessarily standard ways. But so anybody got kicked out, it was kind of like a badge of courage, but 3-day suspension, then you could come back. Yet women tell me that one of the reasons I like gyms is that he was really clear about nobody got to be mean-spirited or, hit on women and all that. He was cautious about that. So that was, I think, kind of a nice thing. And just to say it, I mean, he had started that, as I understand it, as a little confectionery. And so, I mean, this is a very early business person in downtown Savannah. Before there was, particularly at night, there wasn't much business. So, I mean, I would say he was like a pioneer. And he opened two, to not be on River Street and be in the entertainment business in the 70s was unusual. Unless you were a strip club, which would have been more up on this, on the north side of Bay Street. And so he was actually kind of on the edge, just up here, one street north of Bay. And then when he was 2 streets north of Broughton on Whitaker, that was the edge, because Congress Street had really become kind of the entertainment district, but Broughton divided. So, I mean, in both of those situations, he was a bit of a pioneer. And then Wes, who owns El Rocco, was a good customer, complicated customer, but a good customer. And I think the El Rocco thing is, in some ways, there's a little bit of an homage to Jim in there, particularly with their love of music and how music oriented that place is. But I mean, Jim's, it was a different time in downtown Savannah, and Jim's he was part of the connective tissue of Savannah, that people from many different walks of life somehow walked into there, and there was a conversation bar, no TV. So it was a true conversation bar with that great jukebox. And the joke I always tell people is I went to school at Armstrong, and I was educated at Jim Collins' bar. And I think that's a fair statement. But to have 70 people show up, I mean, 20 years people loved you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to circle back because for some reason I have this impression that you had a vehicle that maybe was meaningful, and I might be wrong about this, but when did you start driving around in Savannah?
Yeah. Well, yes. If I had a nickel for every dollar I've spent on a car because I loved it, I would be a rich man. It took me like way into my adulthood to realize that really the car you wanted was one that was dependable and had air conditioning and was paid for. That's really the car you want. I didn't understand that for a long time. So my first car in high school was a 1948 Cadillac. So I drove that to Jenkins in 1970, 68 and 68, 69. So I drove that, and that was a $250 car that got pulled out of a garage on Waffle Avenue. My father knew the people. I painted it purple, Earl Shop paint job, $29.95 Earl Shop paint job, and I had done the body work myself, and that immediately cracked through. And so then I put hippie flower power stick-on flowers on it to cover where the body work had broken through. So now I'm driving a purple 1948 Cadillac with hippie flowers on it to high school. So that was the beginning of all that. And then I went through a series of Volkswagens, vans and Beetles. And then the car that people kind of, I kept for 30 years was a 64 Volkswagen Club Cab pickup. So front seat, back seat, and pickup seat. And not many of those running around anymore. So I kept that for about 30 years. So yeah, I've had kind of a car thing. Never about speed or anything like that, just about kind of funk.
And I also kind of wanted to ask that because you talk about growing up and there being woods,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I kind of want to talk about how the Savannah you grew up and how you saw it change, the development of the South Side. So can you talk a little bit about what Savannah was and how it changed, sort of that whole area?
Yeah. These are obviously my recollections. Other people will have different ways of thinking about it. All right. So we lived on Barn Drive, I do remember when the oak trees were planted in Kensington and in Groveland. Our subdivision was called Groveland. It was like the little subdivision to the west of Kensington, a bigger subdivision. Okay. But I can remember the city came along with an auger truck, and then the tree. All right, so when you're a boy or a girl, I guess, that's under 12 years old, it's pretty interesting, right? Well, if you drive through Groveland and particularly Kensington now, you'd see the oak tree cover across those streets and roads. I mean, it's pretty wonderful, right? So I always grew up thinking oak trees grew so slow, you'd never see them actually mature. But that's not true. You just have to get old. You can see it. So that's one memory of those days. Most of the kids that in those neighborhoods, again, World War II neighborhood, a lot of kids, we were free range kids. We just went out and played. We got sent out in the mornings and called in at night, and we just played. and there wasn't, at least in the world I lived in, there wasn't a lot of organized activity. And I was involved with the Panthers and the Tigers, which was like a little Pee Wee League, a little bit of that. But in general, we just played, and Habersham Woods hadn't been developed yet, and so those woods were kind of our playground. We went in those woods, had a big time. I remember when Curtis Lewis built his house in Habersham Woods, he developed that. That was his project. And I remember when he developed that, the trees that got cut down on the lot that he built his house on, I think we floated some of those trees down the canal. I mean, we were pretty excited about all that. So we had the canal that was within bicycle distance, even walking distance. We had the woods. And then again, if you went back north on Habersham, you got to the Habersham Shopping Center. And that was great. At Woolworths, and almost every store there was owned by someone that my parents seemed to know. And so when we go shopping or whatever, it was very personal. Really different than like going to a Walmart or going somewhere where you're just a customer. I mean, it was really it had a very warm kind of feel to it. The Durin Shopping Center had been established, and there was a restaurant called The Globe, a drive-in called The Globe, right on the corner of Durin and Abercorn, and had a drive-in thing, and seagulls just circled it all the time, picking up stuff that people had dropped off the curb, So that was kind of just weird growing up, seeing all those seagulls all the time up above that. And then Ted Hinkle's music store was in the shopping center, and he had the top 100 records, 45s, on a wall behind the counter, and then the playlist. And so you could sit at the counter and ask him to play records, or his staff to play records, and they would play it, and if you liked it, you'd buy it. I spent a lot of time up there. Herb Traub, who developed the Pirates House. Herb was a multiple entrepreneur, and he had built a goofy golf / trampoline entertainment spot on White Bluff, about 2 blocks south of Durin. And so my brother and I would go over there and, again, just kind of spend the day. My mother probably gave us both a quarter and sent us out of the house. And we just, went and did stuff. I worked at Southland Oil Company at a sock station where the 12 Oaks shopping center is now. I worked there in high school, and Abercorn was a 2-lane road. And then when they 4-laned it, it almost broke that business because there's no business, And I think maybe Sippel's Mortuary was across the street, but other than that, it was pretty much the woods. And people talk about how it's, some people can talk about how when Savannah ended at Washington Avenue. They're going to be really older people. Some people a little younger. Columbus Drive. I mean, in my generation, Savannah ended at Durin Avenue, if you will.
Do you remember when Oglethorpe Mall opened?
I would say early 60s, maybe.
Okay. So
roughly. Yeah. And that was a big deal. I mean, that was a huge deal, obviously. Kind of, yeah. And then when Armstrong moved out to the south side, that was a big deal because that was right then. That gave, there was some reason to go out there, if you will. And then the car dealerships moved from downtown to the south. You could gradually see all that begin to happen. Yeah.
Kind of want to get into your career path now. When did you start getting involved with people with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. That was by accident, which is kind of how most things have played out when you look back at it. We were active at Big Israel Temple, and I would say that part of my attraction to downtown comes all the way back to that, because we'd come downtown twice a week, usually go to Temple. And I can remember knowing that there was something really different about the way the way the town looked. It was different living where I lived. It was different even like coming up through Ardsley Park. You'd hit Drayton Street, you're coming up Drayton, and it's different because they're 2-story buildings and stuff, and I'm living in the suburbs, little 3-bedroom, 2-bath houses and all that, different. But then you hit the bottom of Forsyth Park, and it's really different and beautiful. And then we would turn and park on Monterey Square and go to McVicker. So for me, kind of love of downtown, I think, had something to do with that experience of coming into what I still consider to be the most beautiful part of downtown. And I think Monterey Square is as pretty as anything that we have to offer. So I was in Temple Youth Group, and we were, someone called and asked if there might be some folks that would like to volunteer to help out a youngster. And a couple of us went to visit and learn about that. And the youngster lived out in Windsor Forest, which at that time was like the wilderness. And that's a little overstated, but it was considered the deep South Side. So we went up there and met Tommy Broussard, was I think 8 or 9 at the time. And his parents had discovered 2 physicians in Philadelphia named Daman Delicato, their last names. They had the Daman Delicato program, which was a physical therapy patterning program that required 4 people to do the pattern. The pattern needed to be done 2 times a day, 7 days a week, like 345 days a year. That's the commitment you made to let them have you come into the program. So this family had made that commitment. And so again, in hindsight, I look at that and think, that's 8 volunteers a day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year. How'd that work? Well, the reason that worked is because Mrs. Broussard's next door neighbor, Louise Wilkins. Ms. Wilkins worked for Savannah Foods, and she worked for the gentleman who was the lawyer for Savannah Foods, and Joel Williams. And he was in Washington a lot, making sure the sugar subsidies, I guess, were in order, whatever. So while the cat was away, Ms. Wilkins was on the phone recruiting and scheduling volunteers. So again, when I was doing that, I didn't appreciate how remarkable that was, but it's pretty remarkable. So that's kind of how I first kind of stepped into that world, if you will, and I liked it. I was always the youngest person, almost always the only male. It was generally 3 married women and me, and we patterned for 20 minutes, take a 15-minute break and pattern for 20 minutes. In the 15-minute break, I would sit quietly in the easy chair and just kind of disappear. Boy, it's interesting to find, if you're like, 15 years old, it's interesting to find out what married women talk about. I mean, holy smokers, okay, so that was fun. The hope was that we could teach Tommy how to walk, and that's not what happened. But what I did get to see was what it looks like when a family really leaves no stone unturned on behalf of their son or daughter, right? That no matter what the sacrifice is, we'll make the sacrifice to try to help our son or daughter live as good a life as they can. So that was a wonderful thing to be able to see. Mr. Broussard was a Navy recruiter, I think Navy, maybe Army. He was a recruiter, and his wife, took care of Tommy. And Mr. Broussard was also really active at the Association for Use of Language of the Day. He was also active in the Association for Retarded Citizens. That had carried him into civic leadership as well. So I did that, and then I worked for Model Cities. Former Mayor Otis Johnson, who was 10 years older than me. Otis was involved in Model Cities, and I was a Model Cities summer intern, and I qualified, and I went to interned at the Association for Retarded Children to Use the Language of the Day on Eisenhower Drive, and I was attracted to that, and then I went to Armstrong and got a work study position. I qualified for work study, and instead of cutting grass, I asked if I could do my work study at Chatham Association for Retarded Citizens to Use the Language of the Day, and they granted that, which is very kind. I also exempted out of my foreign languages because I explained that I had already decided that I knew what I wanted to do, and so I wanted to take 3 additional humanities rather than Spanish, and I managed to bother Dean Adams enough that he granted that, so that was nice. And so I was out there as a work study, and then I stopped out of college. I didn't drop out. I stopped out of college and went to work full time there, and I taught there when I was really young. I mean, like 19, 20, I don't know, really young. And there were 2 or 3 of us that were young who taught there, and then everybody else was like the old guard. And in hindsight, I wish I'd been more respectful of the old guard, because I just saw them as the old guard. But what they really were, of course, were the pioneers. I mean, they were the men and women, but mostly women. They were the women who in the 50s and 60s had looked around and just realized, well, if we don't do it, nobody is. And they did. And so, like Mrs. Littleman Kicklighter was she kind of ran the place, you know. And then there were several teachers who were parents, and so they had taught. And then I think, really, I mean, the salaries, I think people made like, I don't know, $200 a month or something for a while. I mean, when I went to work there, I think my salary was $4,200 a year. So, but the great part about it was there were no curriculums. I mean, nobody knew what to do. So you got to kind of figure it out. And there was something about that was pretty exciting, right? I mean, just to say, well, okay, well, let's try to figure out what we can do here. And the classroom that I had was teenagers, and we had a goat, we had parrots, we had gerbils, we had lots of things that needed to be taken care of every day. And so we had jobs. And so everybody had jobs they had to do every day in the classroom and outside. We had a job board where you would see your name and then a picture of what you needed to do that day, and you would do your job. Then you'd come back and turn the picture around, and that, you know. Then we had like where we would circle up and talk about, you know, what's going to happen the rest of the day. I mean, you know, again, you just had to figure it out as you went. And some of the families, I mean, I had a student that came to me as a 14-year-old who had never been anywhere. I mean, he lived at home his whole life. This was the first time he was in a public setting on a regular basis. And I mean, for that family, this was a mixture of terror, you know, mixed with some, obviously some sense of hope. I had a student come who had been kept at home until his middle 20s. And so, I mean, you can actually, you know, in the 70s, you could actually reach back and touch the bad old days when people were literally kept out of sight. And so there was that, you know. It was called the center. That would be the way that everybody who worked there would call it the center. And Lois Anthony, who was a wonderful woman and a parent, Joyce Anthony, Lois was her daughter. Joyce once said, and she was one of the parents that even in the 50s, really, except in the 60s, really did the hard work. She said, all we wanted was a place where our kids could go and people wouldn't laugh at them. That's all we wanted, you know. And so I guess my point there in some ways is expectations were not high for people. You know, the expectation was people would have a place to go where they wouldn't be laughed at, where there'd be something to do, and they'd be safe. And that was about the expectation. The younger staff, of course, because we were young and, you know, knew everything, we had different set of expectations. And so there was some interesting conflict during that period. And again, I look back and I wish I'd been a little more respectful. I will say that for me, one thing that did happen is the school that had been, I mean, segregation, it was like multi-segregation. I mean, if you had disability, you didn't get to go to school, right? If you're African American had disability, you didn't get to go to Kicklighter school. You went to the school on Anderson Street that was for black children with disabilities. Or there was a little church basement school over in Yamacraw.
What were they called? What was the one on Anderson Street called?
You know, I wish I could think of it, and I can't. But Charles Gordon was the administrator there, and you know his son recently, with then General Craig, that's Craig's dad, was the administrator there, and then he went into private business. It may have been connected to model cities in some way now that I think about it.
And the one in Yamacraw was part of their in their administration building in
I think
Yamacraw Village?
probably, and again, I think probably organized by, the name Pansy Brown comes to mind, maybe is one of the organizers there. And then there was a school on Tybee called Gentle Haven. And the deal there, I believe, was if you were, and again, I'm just going to use the language of the day, because this is how people talked, right? If you were too retarded to go to Kicklighter, you went to Gentle Haven. So again, there was all this layering and all this, I guess, maybe it was identity politics before we knew it was identity politics, you know. But what I did get to see at the center was when they closed the school on Anderson Street, and probably all three of those, they all got combined into the Kicklighter School, okay? And that would have been in the mid-'70s, I guess, early '70s. What you did see at the board meetings, I'd go to the board meetings, I was young, but you could go, you would see African American people and white folks who didn't know each other very well in the first place. I mean, very few personal relationships across color lines, and who were pretty clumsy with each other in terms of how to think about one another and people's life experiences and that sort of thing. But what I did get to see was that group of people figure out how to form themselves into a functional group of people and work together for the common good of their sons and daughters and for the betterment of this community in terms of being a community that had something to offer people. And again, I think I look back, I'm 19 years old or whatever, I didn't understand it when I saw it, but I can now realize that that was an influence on me. And the other influence on me was that I got treated like a real grown-up. I mean, this was serious stuff, and it needed you to be serious. And if you're going to be here, you need to be serious. And again, when you're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, not everybody has that opportunity to actually care about something enough, or care about something where you really do have to show up and be serious.
That's a pretty serious experience at that age.
Yeah, but it was great. It was great. A woman named Ann Nelson taught there, and I was put in her class as her assistant, and she taught what we're known. I mean, you just look back at the language. I mean, we call that classroom the profound room, meaning the profoundly mentally retarded, to use the language of the day. She taught the profounds. That would just be how you talked about things. But I do remember, and her group was in the storeroom of the shelter workshop. So there are boxes everywhere and stuff, and rocking chairs. That's it. Well, she was young. She'd come from Colorado. Her husband was in the military. The reason she got the job is because she could walk. They only had one car. So she had to find work within walking distance of her house. I thought she was like some big trained teacher. She was just 5 years older than me, and wanted things to be better and different. Mm-hmm. And so being connected to her early was a big deal. And then she would take 9 classes at Georgia Southern. She'd drive up to Georgia Southern taking 9 classes. And then when she'd come back the next day, she would sit with me and the other person who was her aide, and she would teach us what she'd learned. I mean, it was like that. I mean, it was really a pretty exciting time in that way. And then just to say, I like Ben Portman's Music Center. Ben Portman was on the board, and Herman Friedman's Jewelers was on the board, and many other people. Pat Whalen, who was just a tremendous person, and for 20 years really carried the organization in a very powerful way. I felt like I was able to be with people of substance and people who had this strong sense of civic purpose, you know, and I got to have a goat. You know, I got to have a pet goat, and yeah.
So you were there till you were about 21, you said?
Yeah, 21, 22, 23. Then I went to Georgia for 2 years, college, to finish my degree, and worked in the first group home and stayed there. And that was interesting. Again, no regs, no rules, which made it great. You know, I went to apply for that job and rang the doorbell, and the guy comes to the door. It's in a house on Broad Street there, kind of a cross between really almost like an industrial, commercial neighborhood, odd. Anyway, this guy comes at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he's wearing a bathrobe, and comes to the door, he's wearing a bathrobe, and a basset hound is baying behind him, and that's the whole staff. He'd been up like for 2 weeks, there was no shift. He was the only employee, and so 3 of us got hired that one afternoon. If you showed up, you got hired. And so
you said this was the first group
home in the state of Georgia.
Wow.
Right. It's been in the mid 70s. And so, I mean, again, the 3 of us that showed up that day for interviews all got hired. So
this was in Athens?
In Athens, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right on the main drag there. And the people that lived there had come out of, primarily out of Gracewood State School and Hospital, which was in Augusta, and adult men. And so it was 8 adult men and staff, and there were 5 of us as staff, and we would rotate shifts. Dana lived there; he was live-in, and then we rotated. And but I mean, the good part of it, if you will, was again there were a lot of regulations, and so we could do stuff like me and one of the other guys would go out and. I mean, we're in Athens, and we were having a cocktail or 2. And then if it got to be like 1 or 2 in the morning, we might swing by the group home. We might go downstairs and see if any of the guys wanted to come up and have early breakfast. We might go up in the kitchen, and I mean, there was always, I mean, we're feeding 8 people, 10 people a day, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of food, you know, we'd make big eggs and bacon and stuff, and we'd cook that and be, you know, up there having a good time with these guys, a couple, 3 guys and us, you know, in the evening, you know, like that. So, I mean, there was a lot of that you just, if you did that today, they'd fire you, you know. On a more poignant note, I remember one of the guys he had some itching down there, and he asked me if I could, you know, I said, you know, go down and said, we'll figure it out. So I got whatever the spray is you're supposed to use out of the medicine cabinet, went down and checked it out, and I said, Milton, what happened here? He says, you know, that's where they cut me. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, that's where I don't get to have babies. And he'd been sterilized at Gracewood, and the way he told the story is that he stood in the line. And so, I mean, again, that's the past.
Mm-hmm. He's aware, and he was aware of what they did to him.
Yeah. If I remember right, and I think I do, he wound up at Gracewood because he was being a bit of a juvenile delinquent in his little small southern town. And instead of charging him and, you know, 3 months in the county jail or whatever, he was sent to Gracewood because he was considered someone that had a low IQ. So he was sent to Gracewood rather than go through the judicial system. If he'd gone through the judicial system, he would have gotten through the system fairly quickly and been back out as a free man. But he lived at Gracewood for many, many years. So that was kind of Athens. And then I got my degree, came right back to Savannah, went to work back at the association again. By that time, it was now Chatham Association for Retarded Citizens, so they had stepped up a little bit in thinking about all this. And just thinking about that made me worth thinking about. I mean, why would you call it Chatham Association for Retarded Children if the people who attended there were between the ages of 3 years old and 73 years old? Well, that would be because one of the stereotypes around people with intellectual disabilities has been eternal child. And so, you know, you think about Pearl Buck's book, The Child That Never Grew. So, I mean, that eternal child stereotype is why that is. If you want to dig down in that a little bit more deeply, one of the other stereotypes that has surrounded people with intellectual disabilities is that of menace. And you could see that, for example, in the character of Lenny in Of Mice and Men. You know, the big guy that's not so smart that kills the mouse, right? It's the menace. Pearl Buck's book, The Child That Never Grew, was considered by families that had sons and daughters with intellectual disabilities a saving grace, because it was much less harmful for people to think about their sons and daughters as eternal children and as menaces, right? But so again, you can sort of see the past, the long arm of the past just continues to, yeah. The other thing I'd say about Eisenhower Drive, if I may, is Miss Kicklighter started her school behind the Pirate's House in Trustees Gardens. And then, Frances McLean, Mayor Malcolm McLean's wife, was one of the women. And there's so many stories in Savannah about the 5 women. Same thing here. This is 5, 6 women that started the Kicklighter School. And Mrs. McLean, one of them, Miss Fountain, Miss Kicklighter, and I wish I could remember the other 3. Then they moved to Forsyth Park. And then as the town began to stretch south side, they wound up being deeded a piece of property on what we call Eisenhower Drive. And that was when there was nothing else out there. And so when I went to work at the center, that landscape, if you will, the street, was the psychoeducational center, which, when you think, which was a school, a day place for children with emotional issues. Prior to that, it had been the Black Juvie. Then you had Chatham Association for Retarded Children and Citizens. And one of the buildings there had been the White Juvie. Then you had the mosquito control. Then you had the health department. Then you had the county dump. Then you had
Brown Farm.
Then you had the Humane Society, where they kill animals. And then if you keep going down, later in the 70s, you had Georgia Regional Hospital. Mm-hmm. As you go further down, then you have Chatham Nursing Home all the way at the end, which had originally been a tuberculosis sanitarium. So
it's not a great record for how we treat people.
Right, and again, out of sight, out of mind. And then the other thing I learned just by happenstance was that particular land had almost no value. And the reason for that was it was on the SAC bomber flight path coming into Hunter. And so I learned that because one day I was out talking to somebody about trying to rent a little apartment on Eisenhower Drive above their barn back against it was rural. And I was saying, you know, I see that developing across Waters Avenue. I see that developing Tyson's Corner. Starting to look, I bet your taxes are going up. And he said, nope. How's that? He points up, and then one of these planes come by. So that whole swath of land had no tax value, and that's why so many of the services for people that were considered unimportant people or devalued people wound up out there. So I later learned that this is not uncommon, that in many communities you can ask those kind of questions and realize that there's a piece of their part of town that didn't have much value, and many of the social services and things were placed over there. Yeah. Of course, no modern entity has helped fix that, because the city grew south, and then amenities and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Let's talk about citizens advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. I had left the Association for Retarded Citizens, use the language of the day, and had gone to work for the Community Mental Health Center. And there was a new effort to try to bring people back out of the state institutions. And so I applied for that job, and there were 23 people hired around the state for different regions. And so and everybody got hired for that job was young and extremely idealistic. And the state's commitment to this was very low. They had to do something because they were being sued. And I don't know, Geraldo Rivera had broken a story in New York about an institution called Willowbrook. And that story shamed the country. And I've heard him talk about this. He was a cub reporter for ABC News, local at the time. He had a friend who worked at Willowbrook who told him about the conditions there and opened the back door. And he and a film crew went in live. And this is back when cameras were, it was two guys to do the cameras and him. And they took footage and they showed it 3 nights in a row on ABC local TV. And he said I've heard him say that the first night they showed it, switchboards, nobody called. And the second night they showed it, nobody called. And they thought, well, shit, maybe you don't care. The third night they had to shut down the switchboard. But it took people 2 days to realize what they were seeing. And that really, in the early 70s, that really galvanized, that shamed the country. And when this country gets shamed, sometimes this country chooses to do the right thing. And so Senator Javits out of New York, proposed legislation to provide protection and advocacy organizations in all 50 states for people who had developmental disabilities. And that really came from the shame of Willowbrook, if you will. And so the citizen advocacy grew out of that here in Georgia. Another thing that had happened was in the early 70s, a set of ideas from Scandinavia had begun to emerge and get some credence, called the normalization principles. And there were American academics who had gone to Scandinavia partly as part of President Kennedy's early Commission on Mental Retardation, and John Kennedy was interested in that because of a sister, if I remember correctly. And they had gone to Scandinavia and seen things that were very different than were here. And so they brought back some of these ideas, and then those ideas began to spread, and they were very, very different in terms of expectations that we could have 4 people. Very different about the need for segregating people so completely, and that sort of thing. So that set of ideas was bubbling up and beginning to get a little bit of traction. And then the Willowbrook expose and those things got connected, and that is really when the deinstitutionalization movement emerged. And again, most states were like, leave us alone. But the deal was, if you wanted to get your institutional Medicaid money, which was a big pot of money, you had to take this teeny bit of money that was going to do your protection advocacy organization. And so that was kind of the deal, if you will. And in Georgia, the people who decided to write the plan, Governor Busby, decided to use this idea of citizen advocacy rather than legal advocacy. And only state to choose to do that. And in terms of citizen advocacy, I always like to say, those of us who started citizen advocacy programs around the state in the 70s, we were basically given the Cadillacs to drive. People who started programs in other parts of the country, they were given Volkswagens. And what I mean by that is Georgia was the only state that had federal money plus state money combined to organize around citizen advocacy. So that's kind of how that got started. The idea was that in Georgia and maybe in the American South in general, the idea of having Yankee carpetbagging lawyers come down and tell us what to do might not be the best model. And so maybe a different way to think about it would be to see if we could invite people who live in a community to get to know their neighbors, and to particularly get to know people that they may not have known before because of the way we think about the idea of disability, and to see if we could find ways for people to draw closer at hand and closer at heart with one another. And the citizen advocacy model, which is what it was a model. It was conceptually developed by one man, and then the model, he put a framework, of implementation framework together, and then people started trying to work the model, if you will. And so that's what we did here. Our first office was in the old Savannah Bank building on Johnson Square. That was a very unusual move, because again, back in that day, the idea that a human service organization would be in the most prestigious building in the city was counterintuitive. That went by accident. The notion there was, well, if our interests are people that are devalued, then let's try to find ways to connect them with people that are highly valued. And so when it came time to look for office space, folks out of Atlanta who helped organize the office, they had a checklist of 15 points. And we measured office space according to the 15 points. And it wasn't about price, and it wasn't about parking. It was about valued status and who's in the neighborhood and who you're likely to meet and what image will it project and those sorts of things. And so that got us off to a good start. I tell the story, I rode the elevators with the attorneys from Hunter McLean. I rode the elevators with the top brass at Savannah Foods. I rode the elevators with the top brass at the biggest CPA firm in town. And some of those people, even today, I mean, talking 50 years, some of those people I still have relationships with, and they were involved with Citizen Advocacy for 40 years. So it was a good strategic move.
Do you remember who the first matchup was?
The first matchup was a woman named Henrietta Perry and a woman named Vermita Grant. And Henrietta worked downtown, if I remember right. And that match lasted for 15 or 20 years. And it took me a while to actually start making matches. We didn't really know it. I mean, we really had no idea if people would say yes. We just I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but it took me a while to start asking. But once I started asking, what began to happen is people started to do more than I or some of the people that were on the core group and the board, sort of folks that were helping kind of get this thing going. People started to do more than we had imagined they would do. And that's when it began. Becky Cheatham really pointed that out one day. She said, people are doing more than we'd imagined. And so that's when it really became clear, at least to some of us, that this idea of citizen advocacy was real. That it was the citizen that was really going to be the person to stand up and stand by the person, stand with the person, and when necessary, challenge the status quo, and when necessary, offer protection. And then the other aha, in some ways, was when we began to hear from people that were called citizen advocates. People would say things like, when you invited me to do this and I got involved, I thought I was going to be the person being like the helper, but it's not really the way this is feeling. I'm really not liking that word advocate. I think maybe the word friend might be a better word for us anyway. Or I'm really beginning to think I might be getting more out of this and learning more about this than Bob is. And so that was another just kind of important moment to realize that the reciprocity there was more reciprocity than I think, again, we had imagined. But again, we were all coming out of our old mindsets, right? I mean, that old historical pattern and the old historical stereotypes, they don't die instantly. So those were a couple of things along the way that really kind of opened up possibility. And then in broad terms, we were small. When I say we, I mean in Georgia, right? I mean, the Georgia Governor's Office had 7 staff people total. The attorney they had to have an attorney. The attorney never went to court. What the attorney did was develop information that took legal information and boiled it down so that ordinary citizens could use it. That would be to support people that were citizens who would become advocates. We had a person that was director of training, and their job, no, they ran the hotline, and they covered all the counties in Georgia with the hotline where we didn't have a city SAFSI office, because the federal mandate demanded that you cover the state. I think the feds, by the way, gave $90,000, a whole $90,000 to cover the state. So I think that the folks that started the GAO, they realized that the state of Georgia wasn't really very serious about this, nor was the federal government very serious about this. So they took the whole thing with a grain of salt. But they were attracted to the idea that the organization would be independent and not connected to the state's Department of Human Resources. That was a check mark. And that the organization was granted the power to be able to get in and out behind the doors, so to speak, of the state institutions. So those two things made sense. So they wrote the plan, the governor signed off on it. And then a friend of someone that became a friend who was very active in all this, he tells a story. He spent one legislative session in the men's room at the Georgia State Capitol, lobbying legislators about funding in the men's room. And so some state money got attached, and then that kind of gave us enough money to do business. Our original budget was $33,000. We had 7 line items. It was a very simple operation. And there were days when I got more done walking to lunch than I did the rest of the day, because you'd walk to Johnson Square, and there were the bankers and the. So I mean, it was the woman that first went to work with us, Phyllis Bush, was a lovely, in every sense of the word, lovely African-American woman. And if her husband had gotten transferred out of Savannah, he had some kind of a corporate guy, she would have stayed, I think, because I mean, we were a great team. But again, I mean, in 1976, for us to be in the Savannah Bank building, that alone was a little bit unusual. And for us to be doing what we're doing was a bit unusual. And to take the job, I had to cut off my ponytail and buy 3 suits. And that was part of, taking the job. So I did cut off my hair and got 3 suits. And I was surprised that when I cut off my hair, I could still get out of bed the next day, because I thought, I'd lose all my physical power, right out of the Bible. And then, we got lucky. I mean, Becky Cheatham, I worked with Becky. She worked at Georgia Regional Hospital when I was working for this mental health center. She worked as a speech therapist before she married Judge Cheatham. And so she had left there and was, I don't think she'd had Margaret yet, but anyway, so we knew each other, and so I reached out to her early on to see if she would help us think about all this. And then Leon Chaplin, who was a city council person at the time, Leon happened to be driving. He happened to drive a Volvo 122, and I happened to drive a Volvo 122 at the time. And he came whipping around Johnson Square and saw my Volvo, so he stopped and we talked to Volvo. And then he said, I want to come to city council. I said, yes, sir, I know. And he said, he said, if you ever need any money, let me know. I said, okay.
I need money.
Yeah, and so we got a little money from the city for a while, and then we decided we didn't need it. We let that go. And then early on, a couple of people, Sheldon Tenenbaum got involved really early on as an advocate, and he went and spoke to the Downtown Rotary Club, and that was kind of a pivotal moment, because in a way what that did was took away the notion that, well, this is an interesting idea, but I'm too busy. But this is an interesting idea, but I'm a businessman. Or this is an interesting idea, but, because nobody was busier than Sheldon. And so that kind of helped us get positioned in a certain way. And then this notion of people doing more than we'd imagined they would do, once those stories started bubbling up, that's, I think, when people began to realize there's really something to this. Clete Bergen, for example, over a 5-year period, organized over 300 people to build a house for a family, so that so the mother's son could come back and live with her and her 5 grandchildren. Her other child had been shot dead in the front yard, and she wound up taking care of the kids. They lived in a 4-room shack out on Coffee Bluff. And Clete, to get Sammy back home, Clete got the Votech School involved, a bunch of churches, Lindsay Thomas's office got involved. In 5 years, 300 volunteers built a house. That story captured people's imagination. There was the building of a barrier-free bathroom for a man, Kevin Fox, who was a principal with Branniger, who was a member at Christ Church. I'd done a presentation there. And I called Kevin to see if he could get an advocate from Jim Burke. And that was the task at hand, was that Jim had moved up here from Jacksonville. His mom had died. He moved up to live with his aunt, and which he did, but their home was not accessible. And that wasn't going to work. He was a 60-year-old man already, with very dramatic cerebral palsy. Never schooled, never allowed to go to school. So Kevin organized some people and raised some money. And then Jim had always said, call the people at Terry Parker Baptist Church, which was their church in Jacksonville. And sure enough, 3 weekends in a row, crews drove up and they built that bathroom. And Kevin acted kind of as the general contractor and the fundraiser and all that. And then a couple of years after that, Jim's aunt kind of got on his last nerve, because he's a full-grown man and she's from the old school and doesn't treat him that way. So then he decided he wanted to move out. And so Kevin helped him find an apartment and helped him move out. And so as a 62-year-old man, he lived, quote, independently, if you want to use that word, for the first time when he was 62. None of us live independently, by the way. That word is a misnomer. The word interdependence is the word we should be using. And I think that many, again, when I look back, families were sold, unconsciously sold a bill of goods. We want you to help your child become independent. That's not the North Star. The North Star, I think, should be, we want your child to be part of an interdependent community. Respectful interdependence is what we should be trying to create and develop for people. But to go back to your question, I think when some of that started to happen, I think people began to notice. And then the other part of it is most of us really live and die by story. I mean, it's not data that really moves us, it's story. And the work what Citizen Advocacy is about is people. And it's about people making a new story with each other. Mm-hmm. And so, the nature of it was attractive to people, I think, in that way. And in some ways, it was audacious. I used to like to go talk to a business person, and invite them to get involved. And more than once I have the person say, well, I don't think I'm going to do this, but I give you credit. I give you credit for showing up and asking me, mm-hmm. And then maybe, 2 weeks later, a check would come in the mail and say, I'm not able to participate this time, but it's like that. So, it kind of got built that way. But again, with really good support from the Georgia Advocacy Office, and with a couple of people in particular who were very, very smart, very seasoned. One of them traveled the world. He really had a worldwide consultation practice, and he would always come back to Atlanta, and he was on the GAO board, and we would all go to Atlanta and spend 3 days, and John would talk about what he'd seen in Europe, what he'd seen in Scandinavia, and what he'd seen in Canada, and bring back news of things changing in ways that they weren't changing here yet. And then one of us would be flown. One of us would be flown to Toronto, or 2 of us would be flown to Toronto to go see Extend a Family program, or then 2 of us would be flown to Wisconsin to see something. It was a really rich learning environment during those first, 10 years, for example. And again, not many people get to actually start something. The architecture of the past
started and see it evolve.
Exactly. You don't get many chances to actually say, well, okay, you say okay, well, let's see what we can do here. And that's really kind of what it felt like. But again, with a big support network out of Atlanta, and then locally, once we just got our feet down, people were very, very kind and helpful. some of those, again, I mean, Ben Portman, Herman Friedman, these folks that have been interested for different reasons for decades. And so this was just one more way to be interested.
Okay. I'm going to pivot a little bit here. You, for many years, have been documenting Savannahans in different ways. And one of the groups that you've been documenting is African American sign painters and artists. Why do you think that's important?
Well, one reason it's important because I like it. I mean, I've always been attracted to the work. And part of it, I think, is my father used to bring home advertising posters for some reason when he traveled. That was part of it. The other part of it was my Uncle Harold, who I didn't know very well at all, was legendary in the family because he had been recruited by the New York Yankees to play baseball. But his parents wouldn't let him because that wasn't good enough for a Jewish boy back in the day. Well, that's the story that he was told. That's the story I was told. So advertising, okay, kind of a weird curiosity about advertising for some reason. The other part of that is both when I was younger, a woman worked for us who really helped raise me, and I would never call Gladys a maid because she wasn't. But she lived in a downtown in an African American neighborhood, of course, $35 a month rent on Duffy Street. And so two days a week, my brother and I would come downtown with my mom and bring Gladys home. So you'd start to see some of the Afrocentric culture in the neighborhoods. So that was rolling around. And then with my work with Chatham, Savannah, I was out all the time. You know, I mean, a good day for me would be being in 6 different places, bang, 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 appointment. And back in that day, a lot of poor people lived north of Victory Drive. Not so much anymore, but I mean, there were rooming houses around Forsyth Park, and I mean, I can remember going into rooming houses to meet somebody, and there would be a hasp on a door with a padlock, and that was the bedroom, and then down the hall was the bathroom, communal bathroom, and then there was a hot plate like that. So I mean. So again, I just was constantly out in these neighborhoods, and I kept noticing this. And then one day, my very favorite wall was painted over. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I mean, that's uh-oh. And so I started making notes about where signs were, and then I took just some Polaroids, some really simple little brownie camera stuff. Took it to Damar to have it developed, and they handed it back. I paid them $2 or whatever, and I'm looking at it, and one of the employees said, "What's that?" And I showed her, and she got interested, and she said, "I'm here as a SCAD. I'm here. I'm a photography major." So I said, "You want to go out and do some of this?" So we went out on a Sunday morning and took 200 pictures, and that was the beginning of it. And so then for years after that, I would keep notes about what was out there, and then on a Sunday morning, go out and snap. And so that's kind of how that got started. And then we put together a couple of shows, and I had a good response to that. And then over the years, just kind of built it up. I got to know Mr. Williams, Jimmy Williams, who's the most dominant, I think, the prominent of the sign painters of his generation. I got to know him because I was out on Montgomery Street at about maybe Wahlberg early on a Sunday morning, taking a picture on the side of the wall, old green Chevy pickup truck rolls up slowly, and I look in the window, and he looks across at me, and he says, "I hear you've been looking at me." And it took me, I couldn't get it, and then he pointed to the wall, and he said, "I did that. I hear you've been looking at me." And that's how we met. And then one thing led to another. He was married to a woman whose family owned the confectionery on the corner of 36 and MLK, A.B. Futch. He was married to the Futch's daughter, and the Futches were legendary in that neighborhood as well. And so again, getting to know Jimmy was helpful. And then Leonard Miller, the Sandman, again, legendary. And Mr. Miller had gained some reputation. He was a sign painter, loved Jesus, was a sign painter. Where he really kind of got more known in Savannah was he was called the Sandman because he did sand sculptures at the beach. And then SCAD, much later on, did this thing where they had this contest down there where you built sand sculptures with students. Well, he won, like, I think every year or something. So in the Savannah paper, he kind of became a little more famous as the Sandman because of that. But he made his living as a sign painter. So I got to know him. And then I got to know his mom, and that was great. And then there was a Mr. Polite who came out of Jessup. No, Polite came out of Jessup. And then there was a Mr. Polite who was the generation above these guys, who I didn't get to meet. But he was really the dean of all that. And we've got one picture, an actual picture of a wall that he had painted, but most of his stuff had been painted over by then. And then I've done a TED talk about that, which, done that. And then again, we put postcards out, just done different things with it. But these days, I mean, in my opinion, 25 years from now, people won't believe that African American people live north of Victory Drive. I mean, or certainly won't have any knowledge of that there was African American business culture, business district north of Victory Drive. I mean, it's just going to be different. So I do feel pretty. I'm glad it happened. I'm glad we took the time to do that, and then we kind of built it up and all that. Bob Batchelor has got all 800 of the images digitized at Georgia Southern University. Under, I think he calls it the Wadi Welcome Collection. And so anybody can go and there's open access. And it's interesting, occasionally I'll look at that and you'll see that one particular image, like 150 people have looked at that one, or something, and then others, but anyway, so there's that.
I want to circle back just for a minute. Whenever somebody mentions a woman that helped raise them, I always like to ask what their full name is. What was Gladys's last name?
Gladys Mack.
Mack.
Yeah.
I'd like to raise these women up.
I think that's right. She should be raised up very, very strong and powerful. She was wonderful. And she never had children. And so my brother and I were her children, if you will. And she wound up she wound up dying in our house. I mean, we took care of her in her final years. Yeah.
For someone who's never been here, how would you describe Savannah as a native?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would have to describe it historically, at least, historically, I mean, in my own lifetime. I'm not going to talk about James Oglethorpe, but Savannah is physically beautiful, and I don't think you can escape the physical beauty of the place. James Oglethorpe was a genius, and it certainly is a tribute to good urban planning. No question about that. Savannah is like, I think, I've not lived in every medium-sized southern city, but Savannah has many of the characteristics that I think most, if not all, medium-sized southern cities have with regard to the history of race relations and the whole phenomena of race and slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and civil rights and all of it. I mean, I think Augusta, Savannah, Columbia, South Carolina is probably, I think there's, not exactly interchangeable, but the pattern is pretty strong. Savannah is much less parochial than it used to be, and I think that's a good thing. And when I was coming out of high school, that was really my frustration with Savannah, is it was too parochial. But that's changed over the past 50 years. Some people would say that Savannah has never done the hard work of planning because it's never had to. And there could be some truth to that we've got so much natural resource not just, but I mean in every way. We've got the beauty, we've got this, we're on the coast, which gives us a big opportunity with the ports. We've got this physical beauty, which has created a tourism industry, no matter how you want to think about that. You know, you've got the military. So I mean, there have been some people who would say that the town has been so blessed with assets in some ways that the town has really never had to really dig down and figure out how to work very hard to be very good. I'm not sure about that, but I hear people talk about that. I'm pleased that when people move to town, many people will talk about how well they've been welcomed. And of course, I don't have any way to judge that because I've just only lived here. But I do hear that repetitively from people, that they feel like they've been well welcomed and the town has it's pretty well opened itself up to them. And that if you want to get involved, it's pretty easy to figure out how to get involved here. That seems to be a thread that continues. So I think that's a good thing. Now, this is just me, okay? This is me. I moved downtown back when it was cheap, dark, and mysterious. And I liked it that way. I mean, I lived in a townhouse, 3-story townhouse for $50 on Gordon Street, but I lived with 3 roommates. We lived for $12.50 a month on Gordon Street in a townhouse. There wasn't that much to do at night, but everywhere you went, you knew everybody. And you could get a parking place. So it's cheap, you get to be with your friends, and you can park out front. What's wrong with that? So I sort of pine for that, to be honest. Up until a few years ago, I had either lived and or worked downtown since 1972. Okay. And in that time period, I was the subject of crime once. So this thing about Savannah being so dangerous and all that, I don't bite down on that. When people tell me that, talk about that, I say, when's the last time you personally were threatened in downtown? And so, when's the last time you were personally felt threatened in Savannah? Whoa, never. Okay, fine. So we get rid of that, you know. I'm pretty biased. I decided when I realized I was going to be here, that I wasn't going to go away. What I thought I was going to do, that didn't work out. I decided if I was going to live in this town, I was going to live in the whole town. I wasn't going to just hang out with the guys I went to high school with. I wasn't just going to go ride down Abercorn Street and Haversham Street because I was afraid to ride down Price Street. I mean, I grew up with people that wouldn't ride down Price Street. I grew up with people that wouldn't ride down Lincoln Street because it was too scary. I mean, for whatever reasons, I just decided if I was going to live in this town, I was going to live in the whole town. And that's what I've tried to do. And the work at Chatham Savannah particularly was perfect in that way, because what I was really paid to do was to meet as many different people from as many different walks and wheels of life as possible, and find as many ways as possible to connect people that live on thin ice with people that live on thick ice. Mm-hmm. And so it really was kind of a hand in glove, kind of a fit, if you will. The town has gotten, the pace of change here, this is hard for people to believe, but the pace of change here has actually picked up to where I feel like there are things I should know and I don't know. You know, I can't keep up with what's the new restaurants. I can't keep up with any of that. I can't keep up with, good Lord, I can't keep up with what's going on in Kohler. really until about the 90s. For 20, 30 years, I mean, just kind of was what it was. And then things began to change. But again, things have to change, I understand.
Well, we've almost talked for 2 hours.
Well, I've talked for 2 hours.
So
You've been very kind.
No, I think I've asked you a lot. So I think what I'm going to do now is ask if there's anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to share that we've missed that you think is important to close out with. And it can be on any topic that we've touched on or that we have missed touching on.
Well, I would say that I think it's important to remember that in the early days with regard to this thing called disability, almost up until the mid-70s, say the 50s, 60s, up until the mid-70s, almost anything that happened because a person or a small group of people decided it had to happen. It was bottom up organized like that rather than top down. The top down money and top down policy really didn't emerge till the mid-70s. So I think that's just worth remembering and kind of realizing that you don't always have to wait for somebody else. I would say that there are certain patterns that are very powerful, and you can push on them and stretch them and try to whatever, but the patterns are strong, and unfortunately some of those patterns have to do with, again, this notion of the creation and support of negative stereotypes around certain groups of people, congregating and segregating certain groups of people to be, quote, with their own kind, and then, quite frankly, brutalization and extermination. And I'm sorry to say that, I mean, I studied that, I learned that 45, 50 years ago, and from a kind of a radical thinker. And I'm afraid for the past 50 years that's continued to be, for me, a truth, that those three things, the creation and support of negative stereotypes, scapegoating, segregating and congregating people against their will, sometimes with the velvet hand, but still, and then brutalization and extermination, that pattern shows up in our culture today, and will continue to show up in our culture today. I do think that people with disabilities in many ways are, I'll put it this way, I think people with disabilities unfortunately win the oppression Olympics. And what I mean by that is I don't think you can find a time or a place across time and culture where people who are born with a disability, or disability is their identifying feature, if you will, where that person or that group of people certainly have not been pushed to the edge, and many times just off the edge. That's not true of other groups of people that are called minority groups. I mean, African American people, depending on time and place, have been at the safe center of culture and community, and they've obviously been pushed to the edge and off the edge. Jewish people, depending on place and time, have been at the safe center of culture and community, but also have been pushed to the far edge and down. People with disabilities, I don't think have ever been at the safe center of culture and community. And so that's why I say kind of this idea of the oppression Olympics. With that said, when I travel around, I was at El Rocco Saturday night to see my friend Kevin Rose play some music, and there was a woman in a Halloween costume. Everyone was in Halloween costumes. There was a woman next to me, a young woman, I'm guessing maybe a SCAD student, I can't be sure, who in my opinion clearly had autism and was having a good time. And I wouldn't have seen that 40 years ago. I've got a friend that he helps me do some things, and he's supposed to have autism. I guess he does, I don't know, but he works 35 hours a week and has a huge mental library of media. I mean, just almost uncanny. And then if I need somebody to, help me do something around my house, he's my go-to guy. I wouldn't have seen that 40 years ago. I mean, 40, 50 years ago. 50 years ago, parents would have rather had a diagnosis of profound mental retardation than autism. Autism was almost unknown, and it horrified families. The first film I ever saw, the first teaching I ever saw about autism was when I was at the University of Georgia. It was a black and white film. Ivar Lovaas, who was a behaviorist. There's a man in a straitjacket. He's in a corner, empty room in a corner. He's slamming his head against the wall. He has an electric shock collar on, and every time he slams his head against the wall, they shock him. And this is considered a success because when they shock him, he waits 3 seconds before he hits his, and then they shock him again, and he waits 7 seconds before he hits his head against the wall. And so they're showing this to us as students to show that we can, quote, extinguish behavior. Now, what they don't, what's not talked about is this man's in a straitjacket. He's in an empty room. And you put him in a place where he can bang his head on both sides. Right? So, I mean, that's my memory of so that's changed in a big way. The other thing I would say that's just interesting, I think, is this is really the first generation of people who develop mental disabilities in the history of the world that's ever outlived their families, their parents. That's not ever happened before. And so this is a different time in that way, and we just put all sorts of strain on public systems and all sorts of things. But that is a difference. I mean, the idea. I mean, in my lifetime, parents were told that their son or daughter with Down syndrome probably wouldn't live past 30. That was common advice. Well, if you don't give people antibiotics when they have pneumonia, that turns out to be true. And I mean, in the big state institutions, nobody, there were 2 full-time undertakers at Central State. I mean, just to put that in some perspective. My friend Doug Watson, who worked there in the 70s before he quit. He worked in a building, he said it was a flat roof building, it didn't have any insulation. 1 or 2 people a day died of heat. They literally cooked almost. It's
almost like with buildings, demolition by neglect almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With humans.
Yeah, this was a flat roof building. The drains in the floors. I mean, the first time I went to Central State School and Hospital, you could still see the drains hosed down, and they wondered why people were dying of pneumonia, because there's no glass in the windows. I mean, that's where we've come from, and still a long way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? You'd asked a question about young people. What advice?
Oh yeah. What advice would you give a young person starting out today? I feel like you have good advice.
Well, here's the first one. Take really good care of your teeth. Let me repeat that. Take really good care of your teeth.
You're gonna smile when you say that.
Because as you get older, you'll be glad you did. I'm spending way too much time with the dentist these days. I would say, a little more seriously, but not much, if you can sort out the difference in needs and wants pretty early on, that's probably a pretty good thing to do. And then if you start early, there's less worry. And what I mean by that is pay yourself first. Put 10% of whatever you make, no matter how little it is, put the first 10% of whatever you make every month into an investment account and just start the habit. And the earlier you start, the less you're going to worry down the road. I grew up in a generation where we didn't trust anybody past 30. Many of us didn't think we were going to live past 30. That's turned out not to be true.
Yeah. I'm of the generation where I'm not so sure I'll have Social Security. So.
Right. Yeah. So for a young person, I would say that's an optimistic view, right? The world's going to be here. the financial system is going to be different, but there's going to be some type of financial system. Just the first 10%, I think, is pretty good advice. And then, like I say, needs and wants. That's my friend John McKnight tells a story about he and Yvonne Illich driving from Chicago to Spring Green. He has a place there. Illich says, "Pull over, pull over, pull over." They pull over, and so he says, "I need to get out of the car." He gets out of the car. John gets out. He says, "We're looking just into this cornfield. The corn's like 12 feet tall. Looking at this cornfield, and Illich, takes a leak. And Illich has written like Medical Nemesis and a bunch of books that really sort of takes a look at the technological world in the 60s and 70s and kind of decodes it, strips it, if you will. Medical Nemesis being his best book. And a lot of it's about the excesses of Western life. And Illich says, "I wanted that beer and I needed to pee." And that's the difference in needs and wants.
Well, I think that chuckle is a good way to end. All right. Well, I'm going to thank you for sharing all of your life experiences with us today and your parting wisdom.
Well, let me just say that's not all my life experiences.
No, I know. we would need many more sessions.
No, we wouldn't. I wouldn't tell you about those are the ones I'm willing to share. Well, thank you. I hope there's something in there that people can actually use.
Yeah.
Time will tell.
Absolutely.